So welcome back to a new behind the scenes airport update edition vlog. I still don't know what I've ended up calling all of this, but today we need those. And what we're doing with them, well, I'll show you. You see, after we have painted our board, we of course need to work on the markings, which I have actually already started to do here on the board. But I thought we could take a section and work on it together so I can show you how I do my things. And of course, if you have any questions, you can then leave them in the comments. And of course, if you have any experience with this yourself and perhaps have some good advice, then you're of course also free to share that in the comment section below so that everyone in the community can benefit from it. So just before we start off with this is just the way I do it. I'm not claiming this is the only way to do it. And I've been doing this quite a few times, so there are a few things that I'm basically skipping nowadays or taking a little bit more loosely. You can measure everything up super precisely beforehand. I'm doing it a little bit more freestyle, but as I said, this is just the way I do it, and ultimately you should do it the way you feel comfortable with. Now, when it comes to these kind of markings, of course you can do things wrong, but most of the time you will do it right, because ultimately there are many variations as to how these kind of ground markings are being made. When you look at Google Maps at various airports around the world, you will see how much variety there actually is. When it comes to these kind of setups, I try to keep them fairly simple because I want to have as much flexibility as possible placing the aircraft models afterwards. You make the markings just the way you like it. But here is how I do it. So in order to make these kind of markings, I need some tools. Mainly I need some rulers. I have here one in metal and a few in plastic. This kind of ruler is obviously very useful when making corners, but I will show you a little bit later. Then of course we need some markers. The most common ones here when it comes to colors that you will see is of course yellow for center lines, white and red. Now I am using these kind of Posca pens. I'm sure there are other brands out there as well, but I was recommended them a long time ago and I've always been happy with them. But I am using the Posca pens with a pin tip of 0.7 millimeters. But there are two variants of those. There are these kind of bullet-shaped pins, I guess, or pens they're called, and then you have these pin types, and honestly speaking I prefer the pin types. While the line you're drawing is pretty much the same width, I tend to have less issues with colors spreading around the board when using these pin types, but again, this is just personal preference. Now, these kind of pens do exist in a whole lot of colors. I do, for example, also have a light blue one. A light green one could also be useful. That would mainly be, for example, when you have markings on your airside where passengers are walking on the airfield around to mark the areas where they can walk or not. But for a stand, it's usually just white, red and yellow. But again, there are many variations out there, so just find the one that you like. Now, when I make my markings for the stands, what I tend to do is I work my way from the bottom and then upwards. What do I mean by that? Well, as you can see here with this, is we have some squares. That's of course to simulate the concrete. That's not something you have to do. I just like to have these squares because it just adds a bit to a setup. Then of course I have the center lines. In this case I have two. Often you see one, but there are again here different variants around the world. In this case I went for two here. Here, for example, I only have one. And then at the end of the parking position you have normally at least a red, sometimes also red and white. And this is basically a marking showing as to how far an aircraft at the maximum can can go out towards the taxiway. It cannot cross this line when in the gate. All right, obviously first we need to clear out the space so that we can really access the base plate. Also be absolutely sure that the paint that you have added to your base plate is dry. This is absolutely essential. What I normally do here is, when I've painted with my acrylic paint, is that I leave it to dry for at least 1 day. It will be dry before that, but then you are 100% sure that you're working on a dry surface. All right, so for the squares that I want to do, there are different variants you can do. I mean, you can measure everything up and make a grid. What I tend to do, because it's just much more simple, I just take a ruler. Now for the other stands that I've been doing so far, I've been using this metal ruler and then just take the width of that for my squares. But I think on this side of the airport I would like to have a little bit smaller squares, so I will take this ruler because it's just a bit smaller. It doesn't matter if it's plastic or metal, you just need a ruler. Now for the lines, for the squares in the concrete, I have often used just a ball pin, black in color normally. Today I'm just using this pen because that's what I have at hand. Again, you can be creative here. So we just start off by drawing a line here. There we go. And then on the other side, just be sure that the ruler does not move while you're doing this. There you go, we have the first lines. And then of course I'm just lining it up with these lines that I've already drawn. And then I can just continue here, adding my lines. Doesn't need to be super drawn out. If there's small gaps, it doesn't matter. It actually just adds a little bit to the look. This is just to break up the look of the concrete. I mean, normally you do have kind of these concrete blocks at airports. It's not just like one massive surface. Although I guess that also exists. But I like to have these squares because, as I say, it just adds a bit look to your setup. So when you're taking pictures or filming it, it looks nice. Alright, so we have the lines now. That is the basis for everything that we are continuing with. Now, next up, what I like to do here is, but that's not necessarily something you need to do, but I like to mark up a few things because they will help me later then to replicate this setup. So we have this kind of extension of the terminal building, which leads out to the jet bridge. And because I would like to place this the same place every time, what I'm just doing here quickly is just to mark up the outer edges of that. And then I'm using my white line to add this. Now, when it comes to using these Uni Posca pens, they are very nice. But there's one thing you need to keep in mind, and that is you are adding a bit of paint now to your board. Be sure that your ruler does not move, and be sure that your ruler is applied firmly to the board, because you can get spillage. You can get spillage from this Uni Posca pen when applying color. So do be careful with that. So what I'm just doing here is I'm quickly just adding 2 lines here on top of each other. And what I'm then always do is I try to move this ruler away, but without touching the line I just drew. and then putting away, and then usually I have some piece of paper or something to just wipe away any excess color that might have gotten to the ruler. And this is just to avoid that the paint, before it dries up, smudges all over your board. If these kind of things happen, don't worry, we can still fix it, but it's just much easier if it if it doesn't smudge while you're applying your lines. So here again, 1, 2, and I have a nice line, and then I move up and away from the line. Okay, we of course want to have a center line for the aircraft to arrive. For that, we're now applying the jet bridge and the aircraft type that we are most likely to use here. Again, there are variations when it comes to these jet bridges with Harper wings. Of course, in other scales you can do exactly the same techniques, but there I don't have much experience with the jet bridges. With Harper, there are some jet bridges which can be adjusted in length. This one can't, which is making things a little bit more difficult, because you get more variations with the position of aircraft, and since you can't adjust the length, it changes the angle to where the aircraft needs to be placed. Now, I have a 777 here, which I will be placing up to the jet bridge, like so. Okay, it's more or less straight. Try to be as precise here as possible, because this will determine your center line afterwards. Now, what I do here is, and again, there might be other ways to do this, but what I do now is I take my pen here and just add the tail of the aircraft, try to be right in the middle, and I just make a little mark here on the board, and the same thing here at the nose of the aircraft, and I just make a little mark, because now I have an axis on which I know that this type of aircraft will be placed. But since we might have different aircraft types here, I'm just gonna check that with a narrow body now. So let's see where the narrow body would end up if we are placing it on the board. We can get an angle where it actually lines up with this center line. So in this case, we wouldn't need to draw 2 center lines, we can just use 1. Again, in real life, there will be stands where you have only 1 center line, and that applies for all aircraft types. And there are stands where you have different center lines depending on the aircraft types. For example, Munich Airport. Look, Munich Airport Terminal 2, you will see that there are stands there with multiple center lines depending on what aircraft is going into the stand. Now, before we draw the center line for the aircraft, we have to remember we work our way from bottom to top layer. So we started with the bottom layer, that's the squares for the concrete tiles. I made my little marking here around the building. And what is the next layer? Well, that would actually be, for example, these markings you find at the end of the stand, where you have the markings for the outer edges of that. So that would be a white line and a red line. So we start off with our white line in this case, because that is the line that is drawn the furthest out on my stand here. So let's just take it here, right at the edge. We are adding a white line. Again, I'm just making sure that I get a good coating here. So I'm adding it twice. And then I'm not just taking the ruler off, but moving it upwards and then away in order to avoid any smudging of that. And if there's any excess color on the edge, make sure to wipe it away. Now, we just need to let the line dry a little bit before we can add the next one. While we don't add it on top, we don't want to smudge the line when we're adding the ruler on top of that. And the next line, of course, is then the red line that we're having. So now we are moving just above the white line. That's why it has to be dry before we do that. Again, we make sure that the ruler does not move while we are drawing. And then we are adding our red line. That is then marking the furthest position the aircraft can go to. It cannot cross this line while in the stand. There we go. see, now we have some, well, I don't know if you can see it actually, but we do have some excess paint on the ruler here, so we will remove that just to be sure that we don't have any issues next time we use the ruler and suddenly smudge color all over the place. All right, but now we have a lovely white and we have a lovely red line here. And after that, we are then using the yellow pen to add our center line. All right, so again, we're just making sure that we are working accurately. Take your time with this. You do not have to rush when making your lines. The more time you take with this, the more accurate you work in the first place, the nicer the end result will be. All right, so we have here now the center line. How far should you go? I mean, I usually add maybe a few centimeters, 1 maximum 2 centimeters to the nose of the aircraft that I'm adding. All right, so I'm starting off here at the outer edge of the parking position, and I clearly need to add a bit more paint into the pen. All right, let's see if this works. And we are still lined up. We didn't get too much paint here in the beginning. Let's just draw one more time. Let's see if we can. Now it applies a bit better. Okay, great. All right, so again, I'm taking my time with this and I'm moving upwards and then away with my ruler in order to avoid having any spillage and then just removing any excess paint. All right, so now we have a center line, but what you will see that these kind of center lines often have around the aircrafts that we find around the world is there's often some kind of black line right around it. Honestly speaking, I'm not sure why they have that. Maybe it increases the visibility, but we will do this too. So we are just waiting a few seconds for the paint to dry. And then we are adding our ruler just on top of the line so that we are applying the black line right up to it. And you have to work precise here, all right? And again, make sure that you apply the ruler firmly to the board so that you don't have any spillage of the color you're applying. All right. And just a second line. All right, and then again upwards and away. And we remove any excess and we wait again till this has been drying a bit. It dries up very quickly, so don't worry about that. And then we are adding another line. That's a little bit more tough here because we're now on the other side, but still this should be fine. Just a bit of distance, just so that we are right at the edge of the yellow line, but don't go over it. And a second layer. There we go. And up and away. Great. Now we're only needing one more line here. That's right at the end. Now this I'm going to do freehand, just to close off this outer marking. There we go. Okay, now one thing you will see often with these kind of center lines is that it's not just one straight line, but you will actually have at some positions closer to the terminal building some small yellow lines crossing it. These are markings as to where various aircraft types are parked. But this is not something I'm going to do here. This has to do with the inflexibility of the jet bridges of Herpa. So there is no point for me to make these markings because the position of the aircraft will be changing every now and then. And When I have an aircraft then in the stand, you will hardly see these lines missing, but I could add them a bit later if I wanted to. And of course, if you want to do them, feel free to do so. I'm skipping this little step here, having these kind of lines crossing it. As I say, these are the stopping positions for various aircraft. In real life, you would normally also often see not just the crossing line, but actually next to it then written the various aircraft types for which this crossing line applies. But now that we have the center line and we have marked the outer edges of our parking position, we have one more thing that we want to add, and that is some red markings around the jet bridge. That is to indicate for vehicles where they should not be standing or parking in order to avoid any collisions with the jet bridges. Now, again, you could mark this up very precisely, spend a lot of time on it. I've done so in the past, but nowadays I'm a bit more relaxed about it. I have a rough idea how things should be, so I'm doing this a bit more freehand. So here we have the engine. We want to stay in front of the engine, so we can actually say, okay, we have this marking here, and then we go a bit out here, over here, and on this side it's roughly about here and then going inwards. So now I've just made some very rough markings here on the board. I can take away this aircraft, take away the stand and the extension building, and then I am taking my red marker and I am now marking up things. Okay, so I know that the jet bridge goes to here about, so I'm just marking it up here. There we go. Of course, there are still plenty of markings you could add, but these are the most basic ones that pretty much all stands have in some degree. You can also, for example, let's say you want to have some specific markings. There's also sometimes some writing on stands. What I recommend here is actually to create that in a paint program or something and then print it out. And then just add it with maybe a double-sided tape or some glue to the board. Then you can have, you know, very specific markings with writing on. You won't be able to do that with these pens because, yeah, the writing would be way too little. But yeah, this is how I do my markings. I hope you found this useful. Again, if you have any input, if you have any questions, let me know in the comment section below. If you want to share with the world how you are doing it, then feel free to do so as well in the comment section below. Then we all can profit from your wisdom. But I think this is, at least for now, the end of this behind the scenes vlog. I will continue to make my lovely markings here across the airfield. I still have to do quite a few. And then I will see you in another video here very soon on the channel. I'm checking out, and bye.